"You'll never survive without me," my husband sneered on the day I finally stood up to him. 5 years later, he sits across from me at our old coffee shop, broken and desperate, fighting to win back the woman he thought would never leave. But let me take you back to where it all began. Back when I thought love meant losing yourself to keep someone else happy. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey of self-discovery and transformation. If you're enjoying these stories of personal growth and relationship wisdom, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us build this supportive community. Let's dive in. The summer rain painted Seattle's streets with shimmering reflections. When I first met James Crawford, I was 23, fresh out of college, and armed with an English degree and big dreams of making my mark in the publishing world. Landing a junior editor position at Pacific Publishing House felt like the first step toward everything I'd ever wanted. The old brick building in downtown Seattle, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and bustling creative energy, seemed like the perfect place to build my future. Then James walked into my life, and everything changed. He was 32, the company's star senior editor with a corner office on the 15th floor and a reputation that preceded him like a legend. James Crawford didn't just edit books, he transformed them. Under his guidance, struggling manuscripts became bestsellers, and unknown authors became household names. His track record was impeccable, his taste irreproachable, and his presence magnetic. I still remember the first time I saw him in action during the monthly editorial meeting. He commanded attention without even trying. Tall and distinguished in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, with steel gray eyes that seemed to pierce right through you, and dark hair that was just starting to gray at the temples. When he spoke about market trends and editorial vision, the entire room hung on every word. Even our chief editor, a notoriously tough woman named Eleanor, seemed to defer to his judgment. "Print is dying," he declared that morning, pacing the conference room with predatory grace. "But stories? Stories are immortal. Our job isn't just to edit, it's to curate the future of literature." His eyes swept the room and, for a brief moment, locked with mine. My heart stopped. That evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, I was still at my desk, poring over a manuscript that had shown up in our slush pile. The office was quiet, except for the gentle hum of my desk lamp and the distant sound of traffic 15 stories below. "You have potential," a voice said, making me jump. James stood leaning against my cubicle wall, his tie loosened just enough to hint at the man beneath the polished exterior. The subtle scent of his cologne, something expensive and woodsy, made my pulse quicken. Raw talent, unrefined, but... He picked up my coffee mug, examining my notes scribbled in the margins of the manuscript. "I could help you become extraordinary." Looking back now, I should have noticed how he emphasized the I, how even in that first real conversation, he was already positioning himself as the architect of my future. But at 23, with student loans looming and dreams bigger than my bank account, all I saw was an opportunity. A successful, brilliant man taking an interest in my career? It felt like fate. That night turned into dinner at an exclusive restaurant I could never have afforded on my own. The wine flowed freely as James talked about the industry, his vision, and how he saw something special in me. With each sip, my world narrowed until he became its center. "Your instincts are good," he said, studying me over the rim of his wine glass. "But you're too hesitant, too apologetic. In this industry, you need to be bold, decisive." His hand brushed mine as he reached for the wine bottle. "Let me mentor you. I can help you become someone worth noticing." That was how it began, with a perfect storm of my insecurity. And his certainty, my dreams and his promises, my malleability and his need for control. When he suggested I change my wardrobe to be taken more seriously, I maxed out my credit card on designer pieces he approved. When he hinted that my friendly Personality might make it harder for colleagues to respect me. I learned to be more reserved, more professional. When he said my apartment in the diverse, artsy Capitol Hill district didn't suit my new image, I let him help me find a sleek downtown condo I could barely afford. 6 months later, when he proposed with a flawless diamond ring in the private room of Seattle's most exclusive restaurant, I said yes without hesitation. Why wouldn't I? He was James Crawford, the man who could turn anything he touched into gold. And he had chosen me. Our wedding, 11 months after we met, was a masterpiece of elegant restraint. Every detail carefully curated by James, from the vintage champagne to the exact shade of ivory for my dress. "Trust me," he'd say with that confident smile that still made my heart race. "I know what's best for us." That was 5 years ago. 5 years of slowly disappearing into James Crawford's vision of the perfect wife. 5 years of becoming his masterpiece, his creation, his possession. Until Madison Chen, the passionate girl with big dreams, became nothing more than a character in someone else's story. But even the most carefully edited tales can take unexpected turns. And James, for all his brilliant manipulation of narratives, had no idea that he was about to lose control of this one. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight. It would take years, tears, and more strength than I knew I possessed. But sitting here now, watching him squirm in his expensive suit across the coffee shop table, I can't help but smile. Because sometimes the greatest love story isn't about finding someone else, it's about finding yourself. At first, married life with James seemed like a dream come true. We moved into a stunning high-rise apartment in downtown Seattle, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the Puget Sound. Every morning, I'd watch the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and pink, feeling like I'd stepped into someone else's life. In many ways, I had. James's influence at Pacific Publishing grew stronger, and so did his grip on every aspect of our life together. It started with small things, suggestions delivered with a smile and a kiss, always wrapped in the guise of helping me improve. "Darling," he'd say, adjusting my outfit before work, "that blouse is a bit young for a senior editor's wife, don't you think? Why don't you wear the silk one I bought you?" Or, "Sweetheart, maybe tone down the laughing at office parties. We want people to take you seriously." Each comment was like a tiny paper cut, barely noticeable at first, but steadily accumulating until even the smallest movements began to hurt. I started second-guessing everything. My clothes, my words, my thoughts. James had a way of making his preferences feel like universal truths. The real changes began when I was promoted to associate editor 6 months after our wedding. It should have been a moment of triumph. I'd earned it through late nights and hard work, building relationships with authors and proving myself with each project. But James managed to turn even this into evidence of his influence. "See?" he said during our celebration dinner at Canlis, Seattle's most prestigious restaurant. "This is what happens when you listen to me, when you let me guide you." He raised his glass of expensive Bordeaux, his wedding ring catching the light. "You were a diamond in the rough when I found you, Madison. I just knew how to make you shine." I smiled and clinked glasses with him, ignoring the voice in my head that whispered I'd earned this on my own. That was the thing about James. He had a way of rewriting history, of inserting himself into the center of every success story. In his version of events, he was always the hero, the mentor, the guiding light. Our home became a stage where I played the role of the perfect wife. James insisted on hosting dinner parties for influential publishing figures, events where everything had to be flawless. He'd inspect every detail, from the arrangement of the charcuterie board to the temperature of the wine. "Remember," he'd instruct me before guests arrived, "Richard Campbell is interested in moving his thriller series to our house. Be charming, but not too familiar. Intelligent, but not challenging. We need him to feel comfortable." I became an expert at these performances, at being the woman James wanted me to be. Elegant but not flashy, smart but not threatening, supportive but never overshadowing. I learned to modulate my voice, to hold my opinions until James nodded his approval, to laugh at just the right moments. The worst part? I was good at it. Really good. Our dinner parties became legendary in Seattle's publishing circle. Authors and agents began requesting invitations. James's star rose even higher, and I rose with him. Not as myself, but as the perfect reflection of his success. My mother noticed the change during her first visit after the wedding. We were having lunch at our favorite dim sum place in the International District, the first time I'd been there since marrying James. He preferred upscale fusion restaurants to traditional Asian cuisine. "Mama," she said in Mandarin, watching me meticulously dab my lips between bites. "What happened to my little dragon girl? The one who used to laugh so loud the whole restaurant would turn to look?" She reached across the table, her hand small but strong over mine. "You're so quiet now." "Quiet?" I brushed off her concern with a practiced laugh. "I grew up, Mama. I'm a professional now. James helped me understand how to carry myself in this world." She withdrew her hand, her eyes sad. "Growing up doesn't mean disappearing, Mame. And love shouldn't feel like holding your breath." But I wasn't ready to hear her wisdom then. Instead, I started declining lunch invitations, making excuses about being too busy with work. The truth was, I couldn't bear to see the worry in her eyes, couldn't stand how it made me question the careful narrative James and I had constructed. The real estate listings started appearing on our coffee table about a year into our marriage. Glossy photos of historic mansions in Queen Anne Hill and modernist masterpieces in Bellevue. "We need a home that reflects our position," James declared one evening. "The apartment was fine for newlyweds, but we're building a legacy here." I looked around at our perfectly appointed apartment, with its designer furniture and curated art collection. "I love this place," I said softly. "The view, the location." James's smile held a hint of condescension. "Madison, darling, you're thinking small again. We're not just anyone anymore. We're the Crawfords. People look to us to set the standard." He slid a particularly impressive listing across the table. "Besides, we'll need the space when we start our family." The way he said it, not if we start a family, but when, sent a chill down my spine. It was the first time he'd mentioned children, but somehow I knew he already had it all planned out. When they would arrive, where they would go to school, who they would become. Just like he'd planned everything else in our lives. I stared at the mansion in the photo, trying to picture myself in those grand rooms. All I could see was more space to disappear into. More stages for perfect performances. More opportunities to lose whatever small pieces of myself I had left. The mansion on Queen Anne Hill became our reality 3 months later. 5 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, and a view of the Seattle skyline that made our apartment's outlook seem modest in comparison. James called it our forever home. I remember standing in the vast, empty foyer after closing, listening to our footsteps echo against Italian marble and feeling smaller than ever. "This is where we'll host the holiday parties," James announced, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. "The publishing world's elite, right here in our home. And upstairs—" He wrapped his arm around my waist, pulling me close. "The nursery. We'll have the morning sun." I forced a smile, but my heart raced with anxiety. Each room felt like another script to memorize, another performance to perfect. The house came with expectations, unspoken but heavy, of who we needed to become to deserve such grandeur. The first major crack in our carefully curated life appeared during the Jefferson manuscript incident. Sarah Jefferson was a debut author I'd discovered in our slush pile, a raw but brilliant voice writing about Asian American identity and family expectations. Her manuscript spoke to me in ways I couldn't fully express to James. "It's too niche," he declared during our weekly editorial meeting, barely glancing at the chapters I'd spent weeks helping Sarah refine. "The market for these cultural stories is limited. Pass." Something inside me stirred, a ember of the old Madison flickering to life. "The market is changing," I argued, surprising everyone, including myself. "Readers want authentic voices, different perspectives. Sarah's writing, Madison." James's tone held that familiar note of gentle condescension, but now it grated against my nerves like sandpaper. "Darling, I know you feel personally connected to this story, but we have to think about the bottom line. Let's discuss this at home." But I wasn't finished. Random House just signed 3 similar debuts. They're building a whole imprint around diverse voices. We're falling behind because we're too afraid to take risks. The conference room fell silent. In 5 years of marriage, I had never openly challenged James's professional judgment. His face remained pleasant, but I saw the storm gathering in his eyes. That evening, the drive home was thick with tension. James waited until we were inside, his voice eerily calm as he hung up his coat. "What exactly were you trying to prove today?" "I wasn't trying to prove anything," I said, my hands shaking as I set down my bag. "I was doing my job. Sarah's manuscript has potential." "Your job," he cut in, "is to support the company's vision, my vision. Or have you forgotten who helped? You understand this industry? Who made you everything you are?" "Made me?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. "James, you didn't make me. I worked hard to get where I am. Yes, you helped, but..." His laugh cut through the air like a blade. "Oh, sweetheart, do you really think you'd be an associate editor if it weren't for me? That anyone would take you seriously if I hadn't shown you how to present yourself?" He stepped closer, his cologne suddenly suffocating. "Look at you now, finally expressing an opinion, and it's about some mediocre manuscript that hits too close to home. You're letting your background cloud your judgment." The words hit like physical blows, each one exposing the cracks in our foundation. I saw with sudden clarity how he'd always viewed me, not as a partner to nurture, but as a creation to control. That night, I lay awake in our king-sized bed, listening to James's steady breathing beside me. My phone glowed softly as I opened my email, hands trembling as I typed a message to Sarah Jefferson. I told her I believed in her book, gave her the names of 3 agents I trusted, and wished her success. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt like the first real choice I'd made in years. The next morning, I called my mother for the first time in months. "Mama," I whispered in Mandarin, hiding in my home office while James was at the gym. "I think I made a mistake." "Which mistake, Mame?" she asked softly. "The one you're just realizing, or the one you've known about all along?" I thought about the mansion around me, beautiful and cold, about the careful way I modulated my voice. In public, the practiced tilt of my head when James spoke, the constant performance of being Mrs. Crawford. "Both," I admitted, tears finally breaking free. "All of them." "Then it's time to wake up, my little dragon," she said, her voice strong and sure. "You've been sleeping for too long." That conversation became my lifeline, a secret connection to the person I used to be. While James was busy planning our future, the children we'd have, the society we'd keep, the image we'd project, I began building something of my own. A hidden savings account, opened with my mother's help at a bank, James didn't use. Little acts of defiance followed. I started taking lunch breaks alone, walking to the waterfront to eat dim sum from food trucks. I bought clothes James wouldn't approve of and kept them at the office. During editorial meetings, I spoke up more often, backing my opinions with market research and sales data that even James couldn't dismiss. He noticed the changes, of course. His comments became sharper, his control more overt. "That's an interesting choice of lipstick, darling," he'd say at breakfast, voice dripping with disapproval. Or, "I noticed you've been making quite a few personal calls lately. Is everything all right? You seem distracted." Each question was a test, each observation a warning. But something had shifted inside me. The fear of disappointing him was slowly being replaced by a different fear, the fear of disappearing completely into the role he'd created for me. The breaking point came during one of our dinner parties. James had invited the entire board of directors, along with several prominent authors. Everything was perfect as usual. The food, the wine, the subtle lighting that made everyone look their best. I played my part flawlessly until Richard Campbell, now one of our highest-grossing authors, asked me about Sarah Jefferson. "Heard she just signed a 7-figure deal with Random House," he said between bites of Wagyu beef. "Quite a bidding war, apparently. Wasn't she one of yours originally?" I felt James stiffen beside me, saw his knuckles whiten around his wineglass. But for once I didn't look to him for permission before speaking. "Yes, she was," I said clearly. "Her debut novel about Chinese-American family dynamics is exactly the kind of fresh voice the industry needs. I'm thrilled she found a home for it." The silence that followed was deafening. James's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of pure rage that made my blood run cold. But in that moment, watching him struggle to maintain his composure in front of our guests, I realized something vital. His power over me only existed because I allowed it. That night, after the guests had left and the caterers had cleared away, the last traces of our perfect dinner party, the facade finally shattered. James waited until we were alone in our bedroom, his rage no longer contained by social expectations. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" His voice was deadly quiet as he loosened his tie. "Undermining me in front of the board? Making me look like I missed the next big thing in publishing?" I stood my ground, though my heart hammered against my ribs. "I told the truth, James. Sarah Jefferson's book was good, and now everyone knows it." "The truth?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The truth is that I built this life for us. Everything you have, this house, your position, your status, you owe to me, and lately you seem to be forgetting that." "No," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "Lately, I'm remembering something else. I'm remembering who I was before I met you." His face darkened. "That naive little girl who didn't know how to dress, how to speak, how to behave in proper society. Is that who you want to be again?" That naive little girl had dreams of her own, opinions of her own, a voice of her own. And where would that voice have gotten you without me? He stepped closer, his cologne suddenly suffocating. "Face it, Madison, you need me. You'll always need me." Looking into his steel-gray eyes, I finally saw what my mother had tried to tell me years ago. This wasn't love. It was ownership. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. James raised an eyebrow at my pale face and shaking hands, but left for the office without comment. The moment his car disappeared down our tree-lined street, I was in motion. First stop, my local bank branch, where I transferred a significant portion of my latest bonus to the secret account my mother had helped me set up. The teller's eyes widened at the amount, but she processed it without question. Next, a small realtor's office in Capitol Hill, far from James's usual haunts. "I need something under my own name," I told the surprised agent. "Something ready to move into immediately, and I need absolute discretion." By lunch, I had signed a lease on a modest but charming apartment in Ballard, a neighborhood James considered beneath us. It had hardwood floors, large windows, and most importantly, no memories of being anyone's perfect creation. The rest of the week became an elaborate dance of deception. I bought burner phones, had important documents sent to my mother's address, and gradually moved essential items to my new apartment during my lunch breaks. Each small act of preparation felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. At work, I threw myself into new projects with an energy that even James interpreted as renewed dedication to our shared vision. I stayed late at the office, ostensibly working, on manuscripts but actually planning my escape. Every time he smiled approvingly at my improved work ethic, I felt a mix of guilt and triumph. The guilt wasn't about leaving. It was about realizing how much of myself I'd willingly surrendered. How I'd allowed his vision of me to become my prison, brick by careful brick. Sarah Jefferson's book hit the bestseller list 3 weeks after our dinner party confrontation. The announcement came during our morning editorial meeting, and I felt James's eyes boring into me as our chief editor congratulated the industry on a brilliant acquisition. Such a shame we missed that one, Eleanor mused, scrolling through the sales figures. Someone here had good instincts. Later that day, Sarah sent me an email that nearly broke my resolve. Thank you for believing in my voice when I didn't. Your encouragement changed everything. I stared at those words until they blurred, remembering all the times James had dismissed my instincts, my tastes, my understanding of what readers wanted. How many other voices had I silenced myself to? Keep peace in our perfectly curated world? The final straw came during a charity gala at the Seattle Art Museum. James was in his element, working the room with practiced charm while I played the adoring wife. Then I overheard him talking to a group of industry executives. Madison's come so far from when I first found her, he was saying, swirling his scotch. You should have seen her then, like a rough draft in need of serious editing. But I knew she had potential. The way he said it, like I was just another manuscript he'd improved, made something snap inside me. I excused myself to the powder. Ruman called my mother. It's time, I whispered, hands shaking as I gripped the phone. I can't do this anymore. Her response was immediate. The guest room is ready, Mame. Come home. No, I said, stronger now. I have my own place. I've been planning. I need you to help me with one last thing. The next morning, I asked James to meet me for coffee at our usual spot near the office. He agreed easily, probably assuming I wanted to discuss the previous night's networking success. I arrived early, watching the morning crowd of professionals, hurrying past with their paper cups and ambitious dreams. How many of them were living lives they'd chosen? How many were playing roles written by someone else? When James walked in, perfectly groomed in his tailored suit, I barely recognized him. Or rather, I finally saw him clearly. Not the powerful mentor I'd fallen in love with, but a man so afraid of imperfection he had to control everything and everyone around him. We need to talk, I said as he sat down, his usual confident smile, fading at my tone. And this time you're going to listen. James set his espresso down slowly, studying my face with the same careful attention he gave to manuscripts in need of major revision. The morning crowd bustled around us in our usual coffee shop, oblivious to the moment when a carefully constructed world was about to crumble. Listen? He smiled, that practiced expression that had once made my heart flutter, but now just made me tired. Darling, I always listen to you. What's troubling you? No, James. You've never listened. You've edited, revised, rewritten, but you've never actually listened. His smile faltered slightly. Madison, if this is about the Jefferson manuscript again, this isn't about Sarah Jefferson, I cut in, my voice steady despite my racing heart. This is about us, about who I've become, or rather, who I've stopped being. A businessman at the next table glanced our way, and James's smile tightened. Image was everything to him, and I knew he wouldn't make a scene in public. It was why I'd chosen this place this time. I don't know what's gotten into you lately, he said, keeping his voice low and controlled. You've been different, distracted. If you're feeling overwhelmed with work, we can discuss reducing your responsibilities. I'm leaving you, James. The words hung in the air between us. as stark and undeniable as a printed page. His face went completely still, the way it did when he encountered a plot twist he hadn't anticipated. "Don't be ridiculous," he finally said, reaching for my hand across the table. I pulled back before he could touch me. "You're upset. I understand. We can work through this. I'll call Dr. Morrison, schedule some couples counseling." "No." I took a deep breath, feeling lighter with each word. "I've already signed a lease. I have my own place. I'm moving out today." The color drained from his face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "You... what? You signed a lease? Without discussing it with me? Without my approval?" "That's exactly the problem, James. I don't need your approval. Not anymore." His composure cracked just slightly. "You'll never survive without me," he hissed, leaning forward. "Everything you are, everything you've achieved, it's all because of me. You think you can just walk away? Back to being that awkward, unsophisticated girl I found? No one will take you seriously." I smiled, and for the first time in our conversation, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "That's where you're wrong. I'm not going back to being who I was. I'm going forward to being who I should have been all along. Someone who doesn't need your approval to exist." "This is insane," he said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up in a way he never would have allowed before. "You're throwing away everything we've built. Our home, our position in society, our future." "No, James. I'm throwing away the cage you built around me. The real me, the one who spots talented authors like Sarah Jefferson, the one who knows this industry is changing and needs new voices, the one who can laugh without checking if it's appropriate. She's been trapped inside your perfect creation for too long." "You ungrateful?" He caught himself, aware of our public setting. "After everything I've done for you." "You didn't do things for me," I said quietly. "You did them to me. There's a difference." I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table. "These are the divorce papers. My lawyer will contact yours. I've already moved my essential belongings, and I'll have movers collect the rest when you're at work tomorrow." "Your lawyer?" He laughed, but it was a harsh, unfamiliar sound. "And how exactly do you plan to afford a lawyer? Your salary won't cover the kind of lifestyle you're accustomed to, let alone legal fees." "I've been saving," I said simply. "Planning, learning, just like you taught me, actually. Always think 3 steps ahead. Isn't that what you always say?" The irony wasn't lost on him. I saw it hit him like a physical blow. The realization that I'd used his own lessons against him. That while he was busy maintaining his perfect image, I'd been quietly orchestrating my escape. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous, quiet tone I knew so well. "When you're sitting alone in some cheap apartment, eating takeout because you can't afford the restaurants you're used to, you'll remember everything you threw away." I stood up, gathering my bag. "No, James. I'll be too busy remembering who I am, who I've always been, underneath your careful editing." I paused, looking down at him. "You know what the funny thing is? You're such a brilliant editor, but you never understood the most basic rule of good writing. Authentic voices resonate more than perfect ones." As I turned to leave, he called after me, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "You'll never survive without me, Madison. You need me." I stopped at the door, looking back one last time at the man who had tried to rewrite my entire existence. "No, James. You just need me to need you. There's a difference." Walking out of that coffee shop felt like stepping out of a dark room into brilliant sunlight, temporarily blinding but full of promise. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from my mother offering to bring dinner to my new place. Another from Sarah Jefferson, confirming our lunch meeting next week to discuss her second novel. And an email from Eleanor, our chief editor, approving my pitch for a new imprint focusing on diverse voices in literature. I smiled, thinking of James sitting there with his perfect suit and his perfect hair, realizing that his perfect creation had developed a mind of her own. He had taught me well, perhaps too well. He'd taught me about power, about influence, about careful planning and strategic thinking. He just never expected me to use those lessons to set myself free. The Seattle spring rain had started again, soft and cleansing. I turned my face up to it, letting it wash away the last traces of Mrs. James Crawford. It was time for Madison Chen to step into her own story. The first week in my new Ballard apartment felt like learning to breathe again. The space was smaller than our mansion's walk-in closet, but every square foot was mine. No perfectly arranged furniture collections, no carefully curated art pieces, just my old reading chair from college, a bunch of secondhand finds, and walls I could paint any color I wanted. My mother helped me settle in, filling my kitchen with home-cooked meals and my heart with the kind of unconditional love I'd almost forgotten existed. "This place has good energy," she declared, setting up strings of lucky red lanterns across my small balcony. "It feels alive, like you're becoming again." The professional fallout came exactly as I'd expected. James didn't make a scene at the office. He was too image-conscious for that, but his influence was felt everywhere. Suddenly, my projects faced unprecedented scrutiny. Manuscripts I championed encountered mysterious budget concerns. Lunch invitations from colleagues dried up as people tried to navigate the new political landscape. But James had overlooked something crucial. I wasn't the same woman he'd molded all those years ago. I'd learned to play the game, and I'd learned from the best. "Your proposal for the new diversity imprint," Eleanor said during a closed-door meeting 3 days after my departure from the Crawford mansion. "The board wants to fast-track it." I blinked in surprise. "Even with current circumstances?" Eleanor's smile was razor-sharp. "Especially with current circumstances. Your ex-husband isn't the only one who noticed we missed out on Sarah Jefferson. The industry is changing, Madison, and some of us think it's about time Pacific Publishing changed with it." That afternoon, I received an email from James. The subject line read, "Be reasonable." The content was everything I'd expected, a mixture of threats and persuasion, reminding me of all I was throwing away, warning me about the difficulties ahead. I archived it without responding. The next day, flowers arrived at my desk, an elaborate arrangement of white roses, his signature gesture. The card read, "Let's discuss this like adults. Dinner at Canlis." I gave the flowers to the reception desk and treated myself to dim sum from my favorite food truck instead. James's attempts at contact grew more frequent as the week progressed. Calls from unknown numbers, emails from different accounts, even a handwritten letter delivered to the office. 12 pages of his precise handwriting analyzing our relationship like one of his manuscripts, pointing out plot holes in my decision to leave, suggesting revisions to my choice. "He ordered a background check on your new building," my friend in HR warned me over coffee. "And he's been asking about your current projects, your meetings, your lunch breaks." I nodded, unsurprised. "Let him look. I have nothing to hide anymore." That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to Pike Place Market alone, wandering through the crowds without worrying about maintaining the proper image. I bought fresh flowers for myself. Not elegant roses, but bright, wild sunflowers. I ate street food with my hands, bought local art for my new walls, and laughed out loud at the fish-throwing show. "Madison?" I turned to find Richard Campbell, our star thriller author, watching me with curious eyes. I tensed, expecting judgment at my casual appearance, worn jeans, no makeup, hair in a messy bun. Instead, he smiled. "You look happy," he said simply. Younger somehow, more like the editor who first pitched me The Midnight Tide 5 years ago. I touched my cheek self-consciously. I feel younger, or maybe just more myself. James showed up at my house yesterday. He mentioned casually, adjusting his glasses. Wanted to discuss moving my contract to his personal supervision. Said something about ensuring consistent quality control. My heart skipped. This was it. The professional consequences I'd been bracing for. Richard Campbell's thrillers were our biggest moneymakers. Losing him would be a serious blow to my position at Pacific. I told him no, Richard continued, surprising me. Said I prefer working with editors who aren't afraid to challenge my ideas, who bring their own voice to the table. He paused, eyes twinkling. Speaking of which, when can I show you the draft of my new book? It's different from my usual stuff, riskier, the kind of story James would probably hate. I found myself grinning. I'm free Tuesday for lunch. That night, alone in my new apartment, I started writing, not editing, not revising someone else's words, but actually writing my own story. It wasn't perfect, far from it. The sentences were messy, the structure loose, the voice raw, but it was authentically mine. My phone buzzed, another email from James. This one had a different tone, less controlled, more desperate. "You're making a mistake," he wrote. "Everything I did was for you. To make you better, to make you worthy. You'll see that eventually. You'll come back." I looked around my small but cozy space, at the sunflowers brightening my secondhand coffee table, at the manuscript pages scattered across my desk, at the Chinese lanterns swaying gently in the evening. Breeze. For the first time, I saw my life as a story I was writing myself, not one being edited by someone else. "No," I whispered to the empty room. "I won't." The next morning, I walked into the office with my head high, wearing a bright red dress that James would have considered inappropriate for a senior editor. On my desk, I found another white rose arrangement with an anonymous card. "You're nothing without me." I smiled, dropped the roses in the break room for anyone who wanted them, and got to work on my new imprint proposal. Because James had taught me one valuable lesson, though not the one he'd intended. Every great story needs conflict to find its true voice. 3 months after leaving James, my new imprint, Voice and Vision, was approved by the board. The announcement sent ripples through the publishing industry. "Pacific Publishing steps into modern era," read the publisher's weekly headline. My inbox flooded with submissions from agents who'd previously only worked with James. But success, as I was learning, had a way of making waves. "He's not taking it well," Eleanor warned me one morning, closing my office door behind her. "James has been making calls, trying to convince major authors to demand different editors. Says you're emotionally compromised after the divorce filing." I continued reviewing my manuscript notes, keeping my voice steady. "And how's that working out for him?" "Not as well as he'd hoped." Eleanor's smile was knowing. "Turns out, quite a few people in this industry have been waiting for someone to stand up to James Crawford." The truth was, James's perfect world was starting to show cracks. His carefully maintained image of the brilliant mentor who'd shaped my career was unraveling as more people witnessed his increasingly desperate attempts to regain control. It started with the small things. Meetings would be mysteriously rescheduled without my knowledge. Important emails would disappear from the server. Author contact information would be suddenly outdated in my files. "Amateur moves," my IT friend commented, helping me set up additional security measures. "He forgets some of us remember how he treated you at company events, always cutting you off, correcting you, making you seem smaller." The real turning point came during the annual Pacific Publishing Authors Gala. I attended alone, wearing a daring red cheapao my mother had helped me choose. The whispers started the moment I walked in. This wasn't the carefully curated image of Mrs. James Crawford they were used to seeing. James was there with his new date, a young intern from marketing. She wore her hair the way I used to, spoke softly as I had been trained to do. The sight would have devastated me once. Now it just made me sad. Madison? Sarah Jefferson waved me over to her table, where she sat with several other authors from my new imprint. We were just discussing the winter lineup. Come tell us more about this Vietnamese-American family saga you mentioned. As I settled into the discussion, I felt James watching from across the room. His date was speaking, but his eyes were fixed on me, on the animated way I was talking with my hands, on the loud laugh I no longer tried to suppress. Is he still bothering you? Sarah asked quietly as I walked her to her car later that night. I heard about the emails, the calls. He's trying, I admitted. But he's fighting a war that's already over. He just doesn't know it yet. The next morning, I arrived at work to find my entire department gathered around the break room television. The morning news was running a feature on changing demographics in publishing, and there was Sarah, speaking eloquently about her experience. Then, to my shock, my own name came up. Madison Chen at Pacific Publishing is revolutionizing the industry, Sarah was saying. She's proving that authentic voices don't need to be edited into submission to be successful. Her new imprint is giving a platform to stories that would have been considered too niche just a year ago. My phone buzzed immediately with a text from James. Enjoying your moment in the spotlight? Remember who taught you everything you know. I smiled, typing back my first response to him in months. You taught me how to play the game, James. You just never expected me to win. That afternoon, Eleanor called an emergency department meeting. James sat at the far end of the conference table, his usual perfect posture showing signs of strain. As you've all probably seen, we're getting significant media attention for our new initiatives, Eleanor began. The board has decided to expand Voice and Vision into a full division with its own dedicated staff and resources. She paused, her next words falling like bombs in the quiet room. Madison will be heading the division as executive editor. The position had been James's goal for years. I felt his eyes boring into me as congratulations poured in from around the table. His young date from the gala, sitting beside him, looked uncertain whether to smile or frown. Back in my office, I found white roses waiting. The card read, "Don't forget who you really are." I picked up the roses, walked to his office, and placed them on his desk. I remember exactly who I am, I said to his startled face. I'm the woman who survived you, and thrived. That evening, I treated myself to dinner at the dim sum place my mother and I used to love. As I sat there, enjoying my xiaolongbao without worrying about table manners or public image, my phone lit up with a video call from Sarah. Have you seen Twitter? She asked without preamble. You're trending in publishing circles. People are calling you the face of industry change. James must be losing his mind. I thought about the roses, about his desperate attempts to remind me of who I'd been under his control. James always wanted to be the author of my story, I said, picking up another dumpling with my chopsticks. He never realized I was writing my own all along. Speaking of writing, Sarah's eyes twinkled. When are you going to tell people about your book deal? I smiled, thinking of the manuscript I'd been working on late at night in my cozy apartment. A memoir about breaking free, finding your voice, and rewriting your own story. The advance had been significant, enough to buy a small but beautiful condo in my beloved Capitol Hill neighborhood. Soon, I said, let James have his white roses and power plays for now. The best plot twists are the ones you don't see coming. The news of my book deal broke on a rainy Tuesday morning. Former Mrs. Crawford tells all, screamed the industry. Headlines, though they couldn't have been more wrong about the content. My memoir wasn't about exposing James. It was about finding myself. Still, perception was everything in publishing, and James's reaction was swift and severe. A cease and desist letter? Eleanor asked, examining the legal document on my desk. He really thinks he can stop you from telling your own story. He's always thought my story belonged to him, I replied, watching the rain trace patterns on my office window. That's kind of the whole point. The letter was just the beginning. James launched a calculated campaign to discredit me professionally, suggesting to anyone who would listen that my success was built entirely on his guidance, that my new imprint was succeeding only because of groundwork he had laid. "Did you see his interview in Publishing Insights?" my assistant asked, dropping a printout on my desk. The headline read, "James Crawford Speaks Out, The Truth About Pacific's New Direction." I scanned the article, noting how carefully he'd worded everything. No direct attacks, nothing legally actionable, just subtle implications about my inexperience and emotional decision-making. Classic James, trying to edit my narrative even now. But he'd underestimated how much things had changed. Within hours, social media was flooded with responses from authors I'd worked with, colleagues I'd supported, even competitors who'd witnessed James's behavior at industry events. "Madison Chen saw potential in my work when everyone else called it unmarketable," Sarah Jefferson tweeted. "She fights for authentic voices because she had to fight to reclaim her own." Richard Campbell went even further, giving an impromptu interview outside a book signing. "James Crawford? The man's living in the past. Madison's the future of publishing. She understands what readers actually want, not what some old guard executive thinks they should want." The support was overwhelming, but it came with a price. James's behavior became increasingly erratic. He started showing up at my favorite coffee shops, claiming coincidence. He sent emails at all hours, alternating between professional threats and personal pleas. "Remember that first dinner at Canlis?" One late-night email read. "How nervous you were about using the right fork. I taught you everything, made you everything you are. You owe me." I showed the emails to my lawyer, who advised documenting everything, but not responding. "He's giving us ammunition," she said. "Let him dig his own grave." The situation came to a head during the annual Publishing Innovation Summit in New York. I was scheduled to give a keynote speech about Voice and Vision's success and the changing landscape of publishing. James, who hadn't been invited to speak, for the first time in a decade, showed up anyway. I was at the podium discussing the importance of authentic storytelling when I saw him enter the auditorium. He looked disheveled, his usually perfect appearance showing signs of strain. Our eyes met, and I saw something I'd never seen before in his steel-gray gaze: fear. "The publishing industry is evolving," I continued, keeping my voice steady. "Readers are hungry for authentic voices, for stories that haven't been edited into safe, familiar shapes. They want truth, even when it's messy, especially when it's messy." James stood at the back of the room, his fists clenched at his sides. I could almost see him fighting the urge to interrupt, to correct, to control the narrative. "For too long, we've been telling writers to fit their stories into predetermined molds," I said, speaking now not just to the audience but to him. "To smooth out their rough edges, to make themselves smaller, more palatable. But the most powerful stories are the ones that break free from those constraints, the ones that dare to be authentically themselves." The applause was thunderous. As people rose to their feet, I saw James turn and stumble out of the auditorium. I finished my speech, accepted congratulations from industry leaders, and headed back to my hotel room, emotionally drained but proud. That's when I found him waiting by my door. "Quite a performance," he said, his voice slurring slightly. The perfect James Crawford mask had cracked completely, revealing something desperate underneath. Turning my own industry against me, making me look like the villain in your little success story. "You're not the villain in my story, James," I said quietly. "You're just not the hero anymore." He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the empty hallway. "No? Then what am I?" "A chapter that's ended." I moved to step around him, but he grabbed my arm. "You think you can just write me out of your life?" His grip tightened. "After everything I did for you?" "Let go of my arm," I said calmly, even as my heart raced. "You're hurting yourself more than me right now." "Hurting myself?" His voice rose. I made you. Every success you're enjoying right now is because of me. Those people down there, they're applauding my creation. No, James, they're applauding my liberation. The elevator dinged, and Eleanor stepped out, followed by 2 security guards. James released my arm immediately, trying to reconstruct his dignified facade, but it was too late. Is everything all right here? Eleanor asked, though her sharp eyes said she knew exactly what was happening. Mr. Crawford was just leaving, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. Weren't you, James? As the security guards escorted him away, I heard him call back, You'll never survive without me, Madison. You need me. But standing there in that hotel hallway, watching the man who had once seemed so powerful being led away like a child throwing a tantrum, I felt nothing but pity. James had spent so long trying to control other people's stories that he'd lost the ability to handle revisions to his own. That night, I sat on my hotel room balcony overlooking Manhattan, working on the final chapter of my memoir. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. You did it, little dragon. You flew. Yes, I thought, watching the city lights twinkle like stars. I had flown, and the sky was endless. The video of James's meltdown in the hotel hallway went viral within publishing circles. Someone had captured it on their phone, his disheveled appearance, his desperate grabbing of my arm, his incoherent claims about his creation. The carefully curated image of James Crawford, publishing's golden boy, shattered overnight. Pacific Publishing's board called an emergency meeting the day after we returned from New York. I sat across from James, watching him try to maintain his composure as his world unraveled. His suit was impeccable again, his hair perfectly styled, but nothing could hide the wild look in his eyes. This behavior is unacceptable, the board chairman declared, laying out printouts of news coverage and social media reactions. The company's reputation is at stake. It was a misunderstanding, James insisted, his voice hoarse. Madison and I have a complex history. If you'd just let me explain— The time for explanations is past, James, Eleanor cut in. We've been gathering reports of similar incidents. Other women in the industry have come forward with stories about your mentoring style. I watched his face as he realized what was happening. The other Madisons he'd tried to mold over the years were finally speaking up. His complex history wasn't just with me, it was a pattern. Effective immediately, the chairman continued, you are being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. James's laugh held an edge of hysteria. Administrative leave? I built this company's reputation. Madison's entire division is based on my— Your what, James? I interrupted quietly. Your vision? Your control? Look around. Voice and Vision is succeeding precisely because it's everything you fought against. Because it welcomes the voices you tried to silence. He turned to me, and for a moment I saw through the perfect facade to the frightened man beneath. Please, he whispered. You know me. You know I only wanted to help, to make things better. No, I said gently. You wanted to make things perfect. There's a difference. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, interviews, and legal discussions. More women came forward with stories about James, junior editors he'd mentored, authors he'd guided, all with the same pattern of control and manipulation. My memoir's release date was moved up to capitalize on the publicity. Breaking Free, a story of finding your voice, became an instant bestseller. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. James had always insisted he could make me a success, but I'd achieved it by breaking free from him. Then the messages started coming. First, a handwritten letter delivered to my office. I've lost everything. Are you happy now? Then emails, dozens of them, ranging from angry accusations to desperate pleas for understanding. I made you extraordinary, one read. Everything you are is because of me. He's not wrong. my mother said when I showed her the emails over dinner, at her place. You are extraordinary, but not because of him, because you survived him. The final blow to James's career came when his young protégé from marketing went public with her story. Jessica's article in Publishers Weekly detailed how he'd been grooming her to be the next Madison, right down to controlling her clothes and speech patterns. I saw what he was doing because I saw what Madison Chen survived, Jessica wrote. She showed me there was another way. That article was what finally broke him. I was working late in my office when security called up. James was in the lobby, demanding to see me. He's been drinking, the guard warned. Should we call the police? I thought about it, then made a decision that surprised even me. No, send him up. When James stumbled into my office, he was a far cry from the polished mentor who had once commanded every room he entered. His tie was loose, his hair disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed. Look at this, he said, waving his arm around my office, now larger than his old one. All of this was supposed to be ours, our success story, our legacy. No, James. You never wanted a success story. You wanted a control story. He collapsed into a chair, suddenly looking old. I loved you, he whispered. I only wanted to make you perfect. That was the problem, I said softly. Love shouldn't require perfection. Please, he begged, reaching for my hand across the desk. I can change. I can learn. Just tell me how to fix this. Edit me like I edited you. The parallel struck me as darkly funny, the master editor, begging to be revised. You can't edit your way out of this one, James. Some stories need to end for better ones to begin. I'll lose everything, he said, his voice breaking. The board's meeting tomorrow to discuss termination? My reputation is ruined. Even my apartment. He laughed bitterly. Turns out perfect lives are expensive to maintain. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt the last traces of fear dissolve into pity. You haven't lost everything, I said. You've lost your ability to control everything. There's a difference. Help me, he pleaded. You're the only one who understands. Who knows the real me? That's just it, James. The real you is what you need to find, not someone else's edited version. He stayed there, broken and begging, until security finally came to escort him out. As he reached the door, he turned back one last time. I'll never survive without you, he said, echoing his words from so long ago. I smiled sadly. Yes, you will. But first you have to survive yourself. Watching him being led away, I thought about how far we'd both come from that first meeting. In the Pacific Publishing lobby. He had tried to make me into his perfect creation, never realizing that true strength comes from embracing your own story, imperfections and all. My phone buzzed, a text from Sarah Jefferson. Just heard about James. You okay? I looked around my office, at the wall of bestsellers my imprint had published, at the framed cover of my memoir, at the fresh flowers I now bought for myself every week. Bright, wild arrangements that would have horrified the old Mrs. Crawford. Yes, I typed back. Better than okay. I'm finally the author of my own story. 2 years have passed since that night in my office when James finally broke down. I'm sitting in our old coffee shop, the one where I first told him I was leaving, waiting for him to arrive. He requested this meeting, his first attempt at contact since completing rehabilitation. The James who walks through the door is someone I barely recognize, and not just because his designer suits have been replaced by casual wear, or because his perfectly dyed hair now shows natural gray. There's something different in his eyes, an absence of that desperate need to control everything and everyone around him. Thank you for meeting me, he says, sliding into the seat across from me. His hands shake slightly as he sets down his green tea, not the double espresso he used to require to maintain his perfect edge. The irony of this moment isn't lost on me. 5 years ago, I sat in this same spot, terrified but determined, telling him I was leaving. Now he's the one who seems nervous, while I feel completely at peace. "How are you, James?" I ask, genuinely curious. Through industry gossip and mutual acquaintances, I've heard pieces of his story, the therapy, the career change, the small literary consultancy he started in Portland. "I'm learning," he says with a self-deprecating smile that would have been impossible for the old James. "It's not easy, starting over at 50. But it's better than continuing to be who I was." We sit in silence for a moment, the afternoon light painting patterns on our table. Around us, people tap on laptops, chat with friends, live their lives, all unaware that they're witnessing the final chapter of a story that once consumed me. "Your new book," he says finally. "The novel. I read it. I feel a flutter of something, not anxiety, exactly, but awareness. My first novel, released 6 months, Ego tells the story of a young Chinese-American woman finding her voice in the art world. It's not our story, but echoes of my journey wind through its pages. What did you think?" I ask, more out of courtesy than concern for his opinion. "It's beautiful," he says quietly. "Unedited in all the right ways. Raw. Real." He pauses, struggling, with words, something the old James never did. "I wouldn't have let you publish it 5 years ago. I would have tried to smooth out all the rough edges, make it more conventional. And now? Now I understand that the rough edges are what make it true." He meets my eyes. "I owe you an apology. Many apologies, actually, but mainly for trying to edit your life instead of letting you live it. I think about the past 2 years, about voice and vision becoming the fastest-growing division at Pacific Publishing, about my mother's proud tears at my book launches, about the young editors who come to me for mentorship and receive encouragement. Instead of control, I'm not angry anymore, James," I tell him honestly. "You tried to write my story, but you ended up being a character in mine. And not even the villain, just someone who needed to learn the same lesson I did." Which was? That the best stories aren't perfect, they're true. He nods, understanding finally reflecting in his eyes. "I heard you're starting a mentorship program for young editors." "Yes," I smile. "Teaching them to nurture voices, not control them. To recognize that different doesn't mean wrong. You always were a better editor than me," he admits. "You just needed to edit for the right reasons." As our meeting winds down, James reaches into his messenger bag, so different from his old leather briefcase, and pulls out a small package. "I found this while cleaning out my old office," he says, sliding it across the table. Inside is a manuscript. My first editing project at Pacific Publishing, covered in his aggressive red marks and my timid pencil notes. Looking at it now, I can see how his corrections tried to strip away every unique element, every authentic voice. "Keep it," he says, standing, "as a reminder of how far you've come, how far we both have." I watch him walk away, no longer the powerful figure who once controlled my world, just a man learning to live his own story. Outside, Seattle's eternal rain has paused, letting late afternoon sunlight paint the wet streets gold. My phone buzzes with a text from my mother. "Dinner tonight? The whole team wants to celebrate your mentorship program launch." I smile, gathering my things. In my bag, next to James's old manuscript, is the draft of my second novel, a story about forgiveness, growth, and the courage to let people write their own endings. 5 years ago, I walked out of this coffee shop into the rain, terrified of surviving without the man who claimed to have created me. Today, I walk out into the sunshine, knowing that the best creations are the ones we build ourselves, imperfect and real and wonderfully true. Some people might call this a happy ending, But I know better now. It's not an ending at all. It's just my story, continuing exactly as it should, written in my own voice, at my own pace, with all my beautiful, authentic imperfections intact, and I wouldn't edit a single word.